evening. I'm Grace Peng, co-leader of the WIG, the Water and Infrastructure Group. And today we're going to be talking about electricity and energy in general. And I want to give a little bit of background to frame what we're going to talk about, what Mohit is going to talk about later, which is that LEAG has quite an extensive, LEAG California has quite an extensive policy position on energy, and we value greenhouse gas reductions, and we also value environmental justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly of groups that are traditionally disadvantaged. So we take a big picture look at decarbonization, but also we want to make it at least as fair, hopefully fairer than the status quo. And so that, and we also are very mindful of that we have in resource adequacy, that we never have the large scale, what are called shedding events, where you just black out large sections of the country at, without any of the state, without any notice, like what happened in Texas last winter. So we value safety very much in California. And that is why we do the things that we do. And I also want to go show you, oops, go to the very, I have another slide at the end, which is like, keep in mind, as you're listening to our speaker tonight, keep in mind our bigger picture, which is that electricity is a significant but shrinking part of our greenhouse gas reductions. And in order for us to make progress on the big blue section at the bottom, transportation, we have to keep electricity prices low enough so that people will want to run their cars on electricity. And also, like I recently upgraded, I swapped out my gas furnace for an electric heat pump. At current electricity prices, I didn't really save any money. I did it because it makes me more comfortable, and I'll have AC in the summer, but I did not save money. In fact, it costs me more money to heat with a heat pump than with a gas furnace. But I wanted to do it to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions, and also there were I wanted to be a little bit more comfortable in the summer. But we want to incentivize people to electrify as fast as possible. We want to incentivize people, as many people as possible, to electrify on a faster time scale, because that's going to give us more greenhouse gas savings overall. Okay. Anyway, with that, I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to read you the very impressive bio. Mohit Chhabra focuses on affecting policy to accelerate the transition to a sustainable and clean energy future. He provides analysis and strategic guidance to policymakers and other stakeholders at the state, regional, and national levels. Mohit is currently working on developing cost-efficient pathways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from California's rapidly transforming electric grid. Mohit has an extensive background in energy conservation analysis. He holds a master's degree in civil engineering, civil, environmental, and architectural engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder, and a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of Pune in India. And we did not overlap at the University of Colorado. So anyone who was at University of Colorado after I graduated is a young man, okay? Or a young person. Anyway, with that, hit it.
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for having me. Grace, how do I share my screen? I can now.
What, when you see the green share screen? Oh,
yeah, I was able to do so. And confirming that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see you. I mean, we can see your screen.
All right. So good evening. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Mohit with the NRDC. My position is a senior scientist. I do a lot of work in the energy sector on the West Coast, primarily California. And I'll talk a little bit about our approach to getting to our decarbonization goals. And our current decarbonization goals were set by Governor Brown, and his order called for a carbon neutral economy by 2045. The same year, a bill was passed to get to 100% zero carbon electricity sales by the same time. And more recently, Governor Newsom's order requires all new cars and trucks sold in California to be zero emissions by an earlier date. So that's our legal imperative. And the slide shows just the ingredients to create a clean energy economy. The idea is to clean up the electricity sector and then convert as many feasible non-electric end users to be electric end users, which then requires a larger electric sector, more electricity, clean electricity, and increase demand. And then you need to work to manage that demand well to make sure you can serve that with enough clean electricity. I think it's a brief overview of the pathway the state's moving down. So the rest of the presentation, I'll talk through the challenges in doing so. What I will do is provide, to the extent possible, an unbiased view of the challenge and the questions. A lot of these questions are being debated upon right now. So I think it'll be interesting to pose these as questions to you with considerations, and then we can talk about it, or you can make up your own mind as what you think the right answer is. Some of the constraints and co-objectives of our decarbonization are to ensure that electricity remains reliable all throughout. We enhance energy affordability. So as you move towards an all-electric grid and you electrify your car and other parts of your home, your energy bill and your electricity bill tend to converge. So through that transition, the idea is that people would pay less and less of their total income towards energy, especially lower income people. Do it in a timely manner, reduce local pollution, and also consider global environmental impact, because the decisions we make on what to invest in do have a global impact. And one of the imperatives for California is to design scalable solutions. We are ahead of the curve. And a lot of what we're doing is policy research and development, so that other nations or states can take what's successful and apply it in a much more expedient manner. So this is a multiple piece puzzle. So you have to first focus on actions to produce electricity cleanly. Then you have to also manage how electricity is consumed to make sure that electricity production and consumption are aligned, because the basic law of electricity, as most of us know, is at any given point of time, amount of electricity released or produced needs to be equal to what's consumed plus losses. So that's one of the challenges of electricity, and storage is possible, but it's generally expensive. It's getting better. So I'll talk through in these three categories. First, I'll start with electricity production and the challenges there. Then on the consumption side, and then cross-cutting solutions like designing better rates to give customers the right signals and keep electricity affordable. So the California Public Utilities Commission has a planning process, and they oversee all the utilities that are investor owned and the community choice aggregators. The publicly owned utilities and municipal utilities are independent. The California Energy Commission has a nominal sort of purview over them, but they're mostly independent. And what the Public Utilities Commission does is they start with a forecast of future electricity demand. And that considers the impacts of adding more electric cars, more conservation, And working with the Energy Commission, they develop for the next 20 to 30 years an hourly forecast of electricity demand across the state for all utilities, and within them the climate zones. So that gives planners the basis for what do we need to plan for. The clean energy laws I talked about earlier, they mark your carbon emission limit. And then analysts hired by the Public Utilities Commission, they figure out how much renewable energy you need to buy to meet future demand while staying under the carbon limit, and making sure that this is the most cost-effective path possible. And they also check for feasibility. They consider amount of land area available, how much more production resources our grid can take, when you have to upgrade the grid, when you don't. So they consider all of that, and to the best of their ability, they come up with a plan. And it's best to consider this as a very directional plan. And then individual utilities and community choice aggregators take this plan and then implement them, given their basic knowledge, testing the market, and so on. So the guideposts are set centrally, and then the individual actors try to comply with them. So one of the main challenges in decarbonizing our power sector completely is really the last 5 to 10%. Most analyses have found that you can get past 90% of the power sector emissions right now. You can reduce them in a fairly cost-effective manner. The last 5 tons are the most expensive to reduce, and it's around $22 billion a year to get down to our last 10 gigawatts of gas capacity on the grid. But if you were to eliminate all of that, which would be responsible for the last 5% or so of the emissions, the amount of money you'd have to spend per year would more than double. So that's sort of the challenge. And the reason why this challenge exists is that a lot of gas power plants, they provide capacity. That is the ability to produce electricity when we most need it. They may not run. So the question that I'll pose to you is what's the value of that, and how should policymakers consider that? But think of this not as a limitation of a renewable grid, but this really frames the next problem we need to solve as we get close to that point, is how do we get rid of the last few emissions without compromising on reliability or on cost beyond a certain extent. So this picture's been somewhat complicated by what's happened in the last 2 years. Grace mentioned that earlier in the meeting. Summer evenings in the last couple of years have presented a slight supply and demand mismatch. And this is due to many reasons, primarily exacerbated by climate change, increasing heat waves, where people live when they consume electricity. All of these things have caused a little bit of an electricity supply crunch. And there's generally a really big price to pay for power shortages, not just in terms of money or productivity lost, but also in terms of confidence in our shared societal power system and in our efforts to get to a fully renewable grid. For every power shortage that happens in a renewable heavy state like California, there are a lot of news stories in other parts of the country talking about what this means for the future of renewables. Can we do it? Can we not? So there's a pretty big price to pay for falling short. So during these summer evenings, one of the reasons why these problems have happened is evening time is a time when offices and commercial and industrial buildings are running, but so are homes. And a lot of people are cooling their homes around this time. And around this time, solar, both rooftop and supply side, so non-rooftop solar, starts going offline as the sun starts setting. So this puts a lot of demand on the grid. And till now, the best solution that exists is the gas power plants. They ramp up around this time. And we've had a lot of gas power plants go out of business, which is a good thing because they got priced out by renewables. But we need to figure out what to do about this crunch in the near term. Many emergency measures have been issued, including a landmark order last year for 11.5 gigawatts of clean electricity by 2028. And to put that into perspective, that's more than the full electricity producing capacity of Connecticut. And it's the biggest regulatory clean energy order I've ever seen. But these things take time. So the next couple of years will be pretty key. Some emergency solutions have already gone out, like demand response. Some people are resorting to portable generators. And the hope is that we don't have to go through this again next year. So the first question that the community is dealing with, what, if any, role do gas power plants have to play in our long-term clean energy goals? So I'll start with the folks that say, yes, they have a role to play, and then I'll go to no. So the folks that say yes, say if power plants run less, they pollute less, carbon and air pollution. So it's fine to leave them around if they are basically there to provide backup capacity when you need to augment renewables. The other reason is the alternative is to overbuild renewables and storage. And that may be too expensive and may not be as reliable. And here's why the overbuilding comes in, is when California faces, parts of California face climatic conditions such as less sunlight for a couple of weeks on end, which happens, rain, which happens less and less frequently, but it still does. You produce less electricity through solar, which is our predominant renewable that produces electricity. So one way to deal with that is increase the amounts of solar you have. So if you have half the sunlight, you could build twice the amount of solar to still get that same electricity. Same with storage. But at some point in time, that overbuilding cost becomes real. And there's also an impact on where those materials come from. And that's not environment, there's an environmental cost to that as well. So
can you explain what you mean by overbuilding?
So by overbuilding, I mean that on a certain sunny day, say 100 megawatts of solar panel could suffice for a community, along with commensurate amount of battery storage. And that could keep the community running in the summer months pretty well. But in the winter months, when you don't have as much sun, but the community's electric demand doesn't go down by much, what do you do to meet that remaining electricity need? One solution is to overbuild. So you build more solar and storage to compensate for those times. So by that is what I mean overbuilding. So that's one way to get past it, but it does have a cost. The other options that have been put forth is to install batteries right by power plants and come up with rules to make sure they run to the minimum amount. You could capture a lot of the carbon they produce. You could have stronger air pollution mitigation measures on the plants. But the basic theory is, could you leave them around for capacity or not? And I'll get to the no piece. The reasons for saying no to this is most peaker plants are located in disadvantaged communities. And there's an argument to be made that any additional pollution there is unacceptable. They've historically faced the most pollution, faced a lot of environmental injustice. And a true clean energy transition shouldn't further entrench polluting gas infrastructure. We don't know what it might get used for in the future. So those are two sides of the debate that are active in the community now. And from my knowledge, there isn't consensus around this. And nor has the Public Utilities Commission or the California Energy Commission really tackled this in this long-term problem. This isn't just an analytical problem, it's also a political issue. But for now, the commission has leaned towards keeping gas plants around to make sure we don't have power shortages, and punted what to do with the long-term viability of gas plants to a future date. So I could pause there and see if any of you have reactions, or I could go through the whole presentation and then we could come back for discussion items. Do you have a preference? Now, Grace, you're muted.
I think you should keep going.
Okay.
You should keep going.
Keep going, because there are a lot of preferences in the room and we'll never hear the rest.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about demand side actions now. And I should also note that I see there's some stuff coming through the chat, and I likely won't have time to present and look at that. So I'll look at that towards the end.
Okay, well, I'm grouping the questions in the chat, and I'll ask you in the end, okay?
Thank you. So talking through categories of demand side actions, I've no exact science to this, but for this talk, group them into modifying energy use so that people still get their utility, but they consume energy in a more environmentally friendly manner. That could be done through energy efficiency, so you get the same use, but you consume less. Could be done through demand response, where you consume less electricity at some parts of time when the grid is constrained, points of time. It could be done through other behavioral measures and price signals. So a pretty common energy efficiency measure is bill inserts that tell you how much electricity you consume. How does that compare to your neighbors? And a lot of research has gone into it, and they found that people's behavior is impacted, and around behavior alone, based on signals like those, can reduce electricity consumption by 1%, which when you scale up becomes a pretty big deal. The next is distributed generation and storage. And up till now, this is primarily meant rooftop solar and distributed storage. Maybe there'll be other complementary technologies, or when cars with batteries can better connect to the grid, that could come under this category. And then electrification of polluting end uses. So cars and buildings. So this is the opposite of reducing load. This is adding load. California has a very long history of energy efficiency and demand response. And through that success, many markets and technologies have been transformed. Two prominent examples are lighting and higher appliance standards. Almost everybody buys an LED when they buy a new light bulb now. That just wasn't the case 15 years ago. In fact, one of my first projects in the clean energy world was evaluating a lighting efficiency program in California. So one of the headwinds that energy efficiency faces is sort of a curve of diminishing returns. After a certain point, it gets harder and harder to squeeze out more efficiency from equipment. Most of the motors that are parts of heating systems, industries, their new ones, efficient ones, are more than 90% efficient. We're pushing heat pumps. We're getting more efficiency out of them. We've gotten lighting efficiency pretty high. So to get that next tranche of efficiency gets more expensive. So in general, the future of efficiency and demand response, according to me, lies in targeting high energy end users. So up till now, most efforts for energy efficiency have been mass market efforts. incentivizing things at Home Depot, but now we need to get a little bit more surgical, figure out where the high energy end users are, and see if we can come up with targeted solutions there. Better standards, codes and standards that have high impact in aggregate. So small equipment like battery chargers, it's really hard to run a cost-effective program for them, but you can come up with better standards, and in aggregate, they save a lot of electricity. And impacting time when people use electricity. One of the big changes in our grid with the proliferation of renewables has been that at certain points of time, electricity is cheap, clean, and at certain parts of time it isn't. So how do you get people to use more electricity when it's carbon-free and cheap and less otherwise? So bringing us to impacting energy use patterns, it's important to get them, it really helps us get the most out of renewables by aligning consumption with production. And it deflects the need for building costlier storage. Building storage is possible, but that isn't without its challenges. There is loss of electricity while storing and so on. So moving on, the next category of solutions are distributed generation. Rooftop solar and distributed battery have been the primary forms behind. These are both also called behind the meter. So their customers buy them with their own money, they're behind their meter, and then they generate electricity through their solar panels, consume some privately, sell some based on current rules for net metering. And now with storage, they can do that in a manner that suits them. So they can store electricity for times when they think there might be a power shortage. They can also store and sell when electricity prices are higher, and so on. That brings us to net metering. It's a policy to pay customers for the amount for the electricity the rooftop solar panels produces. And recently, the Commission issued a proposed decision on this that has so far been held. They're relooking at it, but it raised many questions and a lot of discussion. And I've listed some of the questions that came up during that proceeding, which was litigated and fairly extensive. So what are the grid benefits of rooftop solar? And how does that compare to electric rates, which customers are being paid at? Out of the benefits that come from rooftop solar, how many are public to all customers connected to the grid? Which one of those are private, only realized by somebody with solar and storage? And then how do you pay for each one of those fairly? Because in the manner that utilities are regulated in California, they aren't allowed to make a profit on buying or selling electricity. They make money on building things. So how do you account for the benefit that solar and storage provide by reducing the amount of building that's necessary? But also, if you underpay or overpay, either the person with the solar panel suffers because they may be not compensated enough, or if you overpay, because utilities pass through these costs of buying electricity straight to customers, then people without solar panels pay more. So what's sort of the balance there? And what's the balance between a signal to promote renewable electricity distributed versus costs that are borne by people who don't have it? And one of the challenges that I personally faced as an analyst working on it was a lot of Californians that don't own homes or don't own homes that get enough sunlight may never be able to get this. So what's the right way to think about the fairness issue? And when we think through the benefits and costs of rooftop solar or utility scale solar or wind or any resource, given that we're moving towards a clean grid and all the new electricity we'll buy will mostly just be renewable. You need to compare the costs and benefits of any one technology to all the alternative means of meeting our goal. So that puts us in a very different place than where we were 15 years ago, where you compare the costs and benefits of rooftop solar or utility scale solar primarily against coal or gas generation. So that's changed the environmental economics of the situation a little bit. So moving on to electrification, shorthand for switching cars and appliances to clean electricity from gasoline or natural gas. For this, you need customers to adopt electric cars and electric appliances, and then also operate them in a grid-friendly manner. And you can't force Californians to do something they don't want. In the end, you do depend on people for this. So you need the right incentives to have people adopt these technologies. You need to have infrastructure that will complement them, make sure there's enough electricity available reliably, and you need to send the right price signals. Customers are unlikely to adopt cars and appliances if gasoline-powered cars or natural gas appliances cost less to own and operate. It becomes a harder proposition for most people. And that's where managing rates and bills for an affordable decarbonization comes in, and is becoming a focus of my work increasingly. So electricity bills, they impact total household budget. And this is generally a concern for lower income households, where research shows that a much larger fraction of their income goes towards utility bills, not so much for wealthier households. And as customers electrify, their electricity bills become their energy bills. So this is an opportunity to alleviate energy burden in our transition. So bills need to be kept in check, and rates, so how much you pay for consuming an extra amount of electricity, also need to provide the right signal for how much to consume, when to consume, and what fuel to choose. In the past, California cared, and advocates for conservation cared a lot more about bills, because we were trying to lower bills by conservation. And in the end, that is what people see, their monthly bills. People don't follow rates as much. But when you talk through the challenges of electrification, rates become important too, because then people do compare the costs of operating an EV or a gasoline-fired car. So one way to reduce rates is to reduce revenue requirement. So in our regulated utility world, the commission, after much deliberation, figures out what's the total pot of money utilities get to manage their operating expenses, pass through of all the contracts they sign for electricity, for building things, and their profit. And this is done through cases. And once you decide that, then rates are designed to just collect that amount of money. So this first step, determining how much revenue requirement a utility gets, really determines their gross income and their profits. So one way is, how can we lower the revenue requirement? And we're investigating a few strategies here. One is to fund a lot of initiatives that are so far being funded through electric customer money, such as low-income discounts or the cost of decommissioning a nuclear power plant, hardening for wildlife, hardening for wildfire mitigation, and so on. And a lot of these programs aren't necessarily have to do with producing or delivering electricity. A lot of these are societal programs. So what if we could fund them through other sources, like from tax money? and that reduces the total amount of money that customers pay through their bills. So you shrink the total pot of money that utilities get to collect. Other ways to do that is to reduce the total amount of money shareholders make. You could do that by reducing the rate of return that they're promised, or other creative ways, such as if there are some risky investments that they own, like certain distribution or transmission lines that may be in more wildfire prone zones, you could buy that and have a public entity control it. Or certain big and expensive future projects, like we may have to build a fair amount of transmission to bring offshore wind online, that could be owned publicly too. And when you do that, you could save money because you don't pay as much for that goes into shareholder profit. And then you also pay a lot less taxes. So those are some of the solutions that are on the table now. The second category of solutions is, once you determine how much money to collect, you could change how you collect it. So you could collect it more progressively, and you could collect it in a slightly different manner. And I'll explain those things right now. So currently, all electricity bills are determined as follows. Someone meters how much is consumed. You multiply a rate by that amount of consumption, and you add a small $5 to $10 charge, and that's your bill. However, a lot of the costs of running and maintaining the grid are independent of consumption. They're fixed. So if you were to collect fixed costs in a separate manner, then you have to charge less for consumption. Because keep in mind, the total amount of revenue a utility has to collect is fixed by the commission. Then they're just figuring out how to collect it through rates. So you could change the way rates are designed. So you collect some fixed monthly charges and you charge less for consumption. The problem with this is fixed charges are generally not progressive. So you don't want poorer homes to be stuck with monthly fixed payments that they can't get out of by consuming less. We analyzed what impact would be if you were to charge the average California customer different levels of fixed charges. And I can talk through how we came up with this, but these are really to bookend sort of a high, low, and a high amount. So a low amount would be around $10 a month, and a really high amount would be $75 a month. And if you were to collect that amount of money as a fixed charge, charges for consumption would reduce by around 50%. For E1 is regular customers and CARE is low-income customers. So then customers have a better signal to possibly electrify or use electric vehicles and such. This is a snapshot of how much you could reduce rates through everything I've talked about so far. So if you were to fund certain expenses that are within a utility's purview right now through taxes, so these are social policy costs, you reduce a couple of cents. If you were to buy the whole transmission system that the utilities currently own and have it be publicly owned and be nonprofit, then you could knock a couple of more cents down. It's not a ton. Another couple of cents if you were to reduce the return on equity, so the amount of profit that shareholders from utilities get. The biggest dent really comes from charging a fixed charge. But cumulatively, with a $20 fixed charge, you could reduce rates to under 20 cents on average a kilowatt hours in PG&E territory. This is the example. And currently, the average is between 25 and 30 and growing. One way to make a fixed charge more progressive is you can charge people different amounts based on their income. So we investigated, what if you were to scale it based on income taxes and household income range. So divided household into 5 tiers based on their income and came up with a way to scale fixed charges based on income. And what you see is that when you do that, in each case, the lowest 3 income quintiles save a fair amount of money each year in each case. The second to highest income quintile, there's not much change there. The change really is in the highest quintile. So this may be a feasible way and a fairer way to collect fixed societal costs of just maintaining necessary electric infrastructure. But then the question becomes, how many charges should be fixed? How do we manage it? What is politically feasible? And how do you implement this? Because as you can see, the folks in the wealthiest end of the spectrum will pay more. And how palatable is that? But on the other hand, their rates for consuming electricity will fall by more than half. So then they have incentives to use electric cars, and they might get more utility out of electricity as a whole. So it's a balancing act. The last category of solutions we looked at was, how do you increase the utilization of our existing infrastructure? So most of the infrastructure is built to handle what's called peak load, so maximum demand at any point of time. That's what the wires are built for. So when everybody's consuming, the wires need to be able to handle that, and so does our, all the resources we have, all the power generators. But if you were to spread consumption, especially as you electrify all across the day, you can get more out of our infrastructure without adding cost to it. And if you were to do that, we found that you could reduce rates by around 1.5 cents by 2030. So it's a modest amount, but note that if rates go down, people will be encouraged to use this more. So the actual benefit that Californians will get is much greater than what you see here, the 1.5 cents, or $100 a year in savings. So most of these strategies to reduce rates and bills, they aren't easy. They require both legislative and regulatory action. So you need some new bills, you'll need regulators to act, and then you'll need customers to cooperate. A question as we start electrifying is, what do we do about our gas system? So if more and more people start using electricity, who pays for the gas system? And a problem that is true and pressing is, it's more than likely that wealthier people will electrify. So that leaves poorer people paying the bills for the gas system. So how do you manage this transition for the gas system? Now, this chart just shows that if lower incomes customers stay longer on the system, they end up paying more of the bills. But maybe a strategy is to first manage and move low income customers out of the gas system while we figure out how to pay for all these assets that currently exist. This just shows, when we talk about rates for electricity and gas, what's a break-even rate for different electric end users compared to their fossil fuel end users. So for example, a heat pump to heat and cool your home, as long as your average rate is below 28 cents, given current gas rates, the operating cost will be the same. This doesn't account for the fact that you still have to pay to buy it, and so on. And the same thing as a chart. So we developed this chart just to understand where the break-even line is between when is it cheaper to operate something by electricity, by gas. And what we realized is, although it is cheaper to operate some electricity end uses than corresponding gas, the line's pretty close. And in some places, it's cheaper to operate things via natural gas. So rising electric rates are a real concern for electrification and affordability. Some other electrification challenges. What do you do about harder to electrify resources? So not everybody might want electric end users. There are certain industrial end users that depend on really high temperatures, and you may not be able to use electricity to produce those same goods. So what do you do there? Do you have viable alternatives like green hydrogen that you could use? And maybe that's what the gas infrastructure will be good for, is these harder to electrify end uses. And what are the specific use cases for lower carbon fuels? And how much should we invest in research and development of low carbon fuels that could make use of our gas pipe system? And the same questions that arise for should we keep the natural gas power plants around arise here too. Is if you have cheaper alternatives available to use that system, would you use it? Or should you retire significant portions of it? Is it an ethical matter? Is the answer somewhere in between? Similar questions arise. Always like to remind myself about why we're doing this. We want to stay within a 1.5 degree C pathway, and that requires very aggressive decarbonization. The IPCC says we need to get to carbon neutral a little after 2050 to be there. And hopefully California can lead the way, construct scalable solutions, because not every state and country in the world has time and resources to do a lot of the policy research and development that we do. So our aim really should be, what can we do that's scalable globally? I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me go through. We have so many questions. Number one is people want to hear more about why it's so expensive to deal with the last 5 or 10%.
So the reason why it's so expensive is that most markets for certain goods work on a supply and demand rule, and prices go up when supply gets tight. And for certain things, you're okay if that isn't available today, you could go buy it tomorrow. But for electricity, that's not the case. It's a utility. We need electricity to be reliable, and we also need it to be affordable. We can't let prices get too high. It's happened in the past in California, usually leads to a lot of bad outcomes. So for that reason, the way electricity markets work is the Public Utilities Commission and the ISO, they require all utilities and community choice aggregators to have contracts with power producing clean or gas generators to a certain amount that shows that even at a crunch, you could meet our electric needs. And that system is called resource adequacy. Right? So yeah, everybody gets to show that we have contracts with certain power generators, and they promise that they will bid into the market when we most need them under a certain price. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So sorry. Oh, go for it. I'll rejoin my.
I'm sorry. I thought you were done. So I wanted to go back to the idea when you were talking about like people using too little electricity. And it's not just about them using too little electricity in the sense that they're not swapping out their gas furnaces. But I was attending a LA County meeting about what to do, how we're going to cope with climate change and heat waves. And remember at an earlier WIG meeting, we had a speaker talk about water safety and how if we make water too expensive, we run a microbial risk of people using too little water so that they don't wash enough to keep a clean environment and keep their family from getting sick. We are experiencing the same risk with high electricity rates, in that even people who have air conditioners aren't running them to keep their homes cool enough. So particularly renters who don't have any control about how much insulation that they have. They're not running their air conditioners, and they're suffering not just heat stroke, and they're ending up in the hospitals in the emergency rooms, but they're losing their kidneys from heat stress. Or pregnant women are going into preterm birth and having and losing their babies because they can't afford to run their air conditioners. And that's the kind of thing that we want to prevent.
Yes, so for that, you need adequate supply of power, even in the most difficult times to produce it. And what that means is, when you think of the most difficult times to produce power for a predominantly solar grid, it's cloudy times.
Or nighttime.
Or nighttime, yeah. So what do you do to make sure you have enough clean power during those night times or cloudy times? There are certain things you can do, such as offshore wind, but those things are expensive. Or you could overbuild storage capacity, and overbuilding starts getting expensive because you really are trying to ensure that under no condition does supply of electricity get less than demand. So that's where the question comes in is, could you keep gas plants around and maybe they work between 0 and 5% of the time, only when we most need them? We'll still be 95% carbon free. Is that okay or not? And that's a hotly debated topic, is how valuable is that 5% emissions gas plants that would stay around would emit? And how much should we spend getting rid of it?
And will the world produce enough battery? Are there enough rare earth minerals and battery production facilities for us to ever meet that last 5% worldwide? And Rody has had his hand up for a long time. Rody, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, Mohit, on one of your early slides, you showed that California had something like 50 megatons of carbon dioxide emissions. I think that's low, but that number probably isn't correct. It's probably off by a factor of 20, low.
So it's just the power sector.
Okay, well, that still seems low. And no two people ever quote the same number, so I don't know where our sources are. And I think all the things you talked about will not get you to 90%. You know, maybe 10, 20, 30%, something like that. But we need a much more comprehensive plan to get the emissions of the entire California economy, not just the electric sector, down to close to net zero by 2050 or 2045 in the case of California. So anyway, I don't know if NRDC has a more comprehensive written plan for the world or for the country that actually gets to zero by making estimates for all the sectors and subsectors, but that's what we need.
All right, Mohit, there's also another question. Would you be willing to put your email address in the chat box so people can follow up with you?
Sure, and just to answer the last question, what I did was I went to the California Independent System Operator that keeps a record of total grid emissions, and they had around 50 million metric tons for 2021, but that doesn't include the publicly owned utilities, which are 10 to 15%. So, you know, I figured it's 10% at least more than that. So I said greater than 55. And you're right, we need massive amounts of investments in clean energy production. And that's sort of the work that I was describing that takes place, where we try to figure out what future electricity demand will be at a carbon constraint. So you can't emit more than so much carbon, and then calculate how much renewable electricity you need to buy and buy what, when. So that process is ongoing. And you're right, it's a formidable challenge.
Oh, and Laureen has a couple of good questions. One was about why like her electricity bill doesn't tell her how she falls like in comparison to her neighbors. And I think that my bill does. It really depends on who your electricity provider is. But she has a second question that's more universal. Why has California built so little community solar compared to other states?
I think because I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I think it's because rooftop solar was lucrative in California because of California's higher rates. So rooftop solar pans out better than most places. And utility scale solar got momentum going. So most of the solar needs were met either by those two, and community solar kind of got forgotten. That's one reason. I also think that it's just hard to get land near urban centers in California. That's probably another reason. But basically, I haven't found a very good answer to this. There's just been no momentum because all the focus has gone to either supply side or rooftop solar. So we didn't really get started.
Yeah, and that's and then that takes us to Joan Hardy from Glendale, who Glendale has a municipal power company, and they're talking about doing a virtual power plant using rooftops around their city. So aggregating their rooftops. So Joan, do you want me to read your question, or do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Go ahead, read it for me, Grace, because
Okay, so let me find it in the chat box. It's pretty far back. Okay, so Joan lives in Glendale, and we have a gas power plant that is up for a major redo. Like some of I think that the turbines are all from all but one are from the 1970s or older. However, there's been lots of delays due to the community environmental groups pushing the city water and power company to create a project that is 100% fossil fuel free. Are you familiar with this project and the brouhaha, the dust up?
This is the recent Glendale. I'm familiar with the fact that it's made some noise. I'm not very familiar with the project now.
Right, and it's an ongoing saga. I think they reversed themselves and they killed it, right?
yeah, it's apparently on hold to do yet more investigation into renewables
And
for a year. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna share my screen real quick.
And
Let me,
similar question has been coming up for some of the power plants on the coast. They're called once-through cooling plants. So a lot of them were slated to retire, like the one in Redondo Beach, but they get extended for these. People are nervous about these summer evening shortfalls.
Right, I think it runs like 200 hours a year, but there are 200 hours that we really need, right?
Yeah, so it's been extended. They want to retire it, and it's been extended twice. And I spoke to an assembly member who was pretty concerned about this. This is just a really hard question. I think the regulators, and this is not my opinion, would feel a lot more comfortable retiring it if we got through 2 summers without a supply crunch. And people are just nervous now.
They really are, yeah, because we already had to shed load. Was it last summer or the summer before? People weren't happy about it. It was very hot. But another thing is, like in Glendale, they had originally proposed combined cycle gas turbines, and then the most recent proposal had RICE, reciprocating ICE, that they were much smaller. And I think people really fixated on the fact that they can run on natural gas. They thought that it would run on gas, but they're flexible fuel ones. They can run on biogas, they can run on biodiesel. And it's part of our California strategy. Like starting this year, we're collecting our food waste so we could make fuel from our food waste, right? But we also need to install equipment that can run the fuels that our food waste create. So I think a lot of people fixated on the fact that it's flexible fuels, but right now most of them are run on fossil fuels. So they thought that it would only run on fossil fuels instead of being part of our clean energy strategy. I think we just did a really bad job of explaining it. Okay, I see nodding. And we have another question from Kathy about, Kathy, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, well, you were talking about, oh, well, I'm just thinking about the concept of, is the US Department of Energy working on a national strategic energy plan and trying to determine how much of the grid needs to be upgraded where? How do we get this reliability from different sources? You know, can some of the solar energy from California be used to power the East Coast when they start to go dark earlier, and if California has excess? Stuff like that. Is the state Energy Commission doing something for California? Is Department of Energy working on a national strategy where we can figure out what it is we need to do on a high level?
So one of the challenges with interconnection and transmission is that it's a multi-regional thing, and it's been NRDC's effort to have at least better regional transfer between the Northwest and California, because the Northwest has a lot of hydropower, California has a lot of solar, and they're pretty complementary in a manner that you describe. For many reasons, building transmission and planning it takes a lot of time, and that's something that we need to focus on. The Department of Energy and the government, they've been trying to, this is the focus amongst many advocates. It's as much of a bureaucratic problem as a practical problem in terms of when a new transmission project's identified to when it passes all of its checks and when it's built. It's a 10-year time frame is what we're talking about now. So it's a focus of advocates and the government now to better figure out how we identify transmission upgrade need and expedite this.
Well,
It's hard to have a central plan because so many needs are regional and change with the season, but something's missing there. You're right, and something's needed. And it's been hard to, at least for me, it's hard for me to identify sort of specific actions and tell you this is what's needed. It's not, transmission's not my core expertise, and also I don't think this problem's been very well solved.
But you know, Dustin Mulvaney gave a seminar last November, and when he was asked a similar question, particularly when it came to transmission and why these industrial grade in the utility scale solar is in these biodiverse desert areas, he said it's because of transmission. Starting with the Rural Electrification Act, the government decided that they would string transmission on public lands, and then solar farms are more valuable when you're near transmission. So this means that if you wanted to do it on private brownfield or retired ag field ones, you wouldn't have access to the transmission lines that either already exist or can be built if it's on public land. And this is a law that has to change. Like for FERC does not have the ability to use eminent domain to build electric power lines the way I can't remember which agency, they can build, there's the feds have the authority to build oil and gas pipelines, even if the owner doesn't want to sell to make oil and gas pipelines. In fact, they did it through Indian reservations. But the feds do not have the same power to string wires to bring clean electricity. And so that's something that needs to be addressed, giving the feds the power, but then also we have to tread very lightly on the Indian reservations because they're sovereign nations. But the Navajo, I know like the Navajo nations have said that they want to work with the federal government on transmission, but they want it done sensitively and with them as full partners.
One of the things I wanted to add too was if there's not an overriding high-level strategy plan, then these transmission lines get proposed as one-offs, and you don't know how it fits into a big picture. And so then it's very difficult to evaluate the trade-offs because there's always a trade-off. Somebody is going to be harmed by it, and you don't know how important that particular line is because it's not part of a plan. So everything has to, it's challenged on every issue, on every trade-off, because you can't evaluate which ones are more important and which ones are less important because I haven't ever seen an overriding plan.
That's right. And one of the reasons is just legally different states, just speaking about the West Coast, even within the West Coast, have very different carbon emissions targets, and some don't have any reduction targets, right? Even like Nevada, like some on the western side of the country. One of our efforts has been, can we set up a West-wide regional electric market so you can start identifying those needs for regional development and start balancing the load across the West. And once you do that, you could better determine what transmission solutions are required in the West. So our Western teams starting off at least trying to solve that problem through the lens of California, Oregon, Washington, Montana, Nevada, and seeing if we can make something happen there.
It seems
I'm
pretty.
going to share my screen really quick to show a Department of Energy visualization of available wind energy in California. And like the pink areas, the pink and the red and the brown areas are areas that have very high winds. And so they have potential to be, to have wind turbines. But you'll notice that there is nothing in operating in, and the blue lines are capacity and capacity factor. Those are where the existing wind turbines are. You'll notice that LA County has some of the best onshore wind potential, the wind energy potential in California. But LA County bans wind development, wind turbines in LA County controlled lands. So we really have work to do on the county level, convincing our county board of supervisors to rescind that ban.
So Kathy, I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Yeah.
We're trying to tackle that by creating a regional market and regional energy balancing.
It just seems like it's a very fundamental question. And if we're going to get where we need to be, that question has to be answered. And then we can see, everyone wants rooftop solar or community solar. Then you've got the trade-offs for reliability with this distributed generation and the centralized generation. And there's got to be a balance, and we need to figure out what it is that gives us the best the best answer for reliable supplies. And it seemed, I just don't understand what our government is doing. They don't seem to be doing anything on this, and I was hoping you could tell us that they were.
So the Build Back Better plan tried to spur certain parts of this, but I think the uniqueness in how much independence states have makes it hard for these coordinated federal push plans to be developed and come to fruition.
Oh, do you want to talk about the transmission lines in New England? The fiasco with the transmission line? I
Go for it. There was a fiasco with the one that from Canada to New York as well recently.
yes, that's the one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Can
go
you
for
talk
it.
to that one?
Oh, why don't you go? I'm going to sip some water while you do that.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so New York decided to shut down their nuclear power plant because Quebec has more than enough hydropower to share and replace that nuclear power plant. So they went ahead, they shut down, they're planning to shut down the power plant, and then they're trying to create the transmission lines to bring it down from Quebec to New York, but you have to go through Vermont. Vermont said, because one state cannot compel another state to allow transmission lines. The way that the federal government could step in, if it were a natural gas or oil pipeline, the federal government can tell Vermont, you have to permit that pipeline. Well, because it's an electricity transmission line, New York and the feds have no power to make Vermont allow a transmission line from Quebec to New York. And I think it's with those things in mind that I showed you that wind map of LA and how we have great wind potential in LA and we're not using it. And that's one of the cases where we have great wind potential and we have it near a great population center that could use that energy. But we actually have a law that bans the installation of wind turbines. So we're basically cutting off our own arm. You wouldn't even have to build long distance transmission lines. It's within the same county.
So Grace, can I make a question?
Yes.
I haven't heard anything about pumped storage plants. It seems like that's a solution that's been used in quite a few cases in other places. And we have a complicated water system, obviously. Some of it's state, some of it's federal. But a lot of what we get from other states is probably also been stored as pumped storage. So it seems like something that we should look into. Even right now we have a drought, but at some point we'll probably have water. So we want to not forget about that.
Well, so what do you mean by pumped storage?
Why don't you let Mohit have, he's shaking his head.
So you can imagine sort of a reservoir where there are two levels to keep water, and you pump water from one level to the other and you hold it there. And then when you release it, you can use it like a dam to produce electricity. And the concerns in California around that have been environmental. Folks haven't been able to come to an agreement as to where to build this pump storage and operate it. And that's one of the challenges for the clean energy and environmental community going forward is how do you do environmentally responsible development for clean energy solutions? How do you balance environmental impact and minimize it while fighting climate change? And another technology that where this is going to come to, that we're going to really have to work this out is for offshore wind, because we're starting to think about it now in the state.
Yeah, because where are you going to put the pump reservoir? A pump storage means you need two reservoirs, and we barely have the space in our for single reservoirs, much
Well, I
less
think
doubling it.
You put the you put one of them lower than the other, obviously. And so you can use, like, parts of the Central Valley could be used as a storage space for water.
So
And then have the water put up into some of the dams that already exist.
there's one project that keeps getting proposed and reproposed. It's just slipping my name now.
Heights Reservoir.
And it's there just hasn't been agreement within the environmental community about how they feel about that. And it's just never gotten off. And every 2 years, I'll see another bill. Is it an Imperial Valley? But that bill never passes. It's a constant cycle.
Remember in the last major blackout, the California State Water Project, which uses over 10% of the electricity in the state of California, they put out a report about how they balance the grid and kept the disaster from getting even worse. Because the California State Water Project, that whole canal, is really just 4 or 5 reservoirs at different heights. And so they were actually managing their water going from pool to pool in order to alleviate the electricity shortages in areas along the Central Valley.
Yeah, they have several dams that they use to actually store water. And they also, have to get the water over from the Central Valley into the Los Angeles Basin. So they have several dams there that they use as well. They are pumping the water from the Central Valley down to Los Angeles through those systems.
Right, but they weren't really pumping that much water that time. But they were managing the locks between the pools so that they could create energy and feed it into the grid exactly when the grid needed.
So one something that you might find interesting is, in terms of geothermal energy, there's a fair amount of potential by the Salton Sea. And there's also a lot of lithium reserves there, which could kickstart production of storage within the state. And that area is in need of economic stimulus as well. So that's something that's been discussed a lot, is could you do some geothermal energy production there, and almost a byproduct would be lithium production, and also start a whole industry there. And advocates are thinking about ways to get that started. It's sort of like a Green New Deal wrapped in one.
It sounds like we need to build a lot. We have a lot of fans that wanted to do community scale solar and use every rooftop that we can. But, and I think that's a great idea, but we do have to worry about the fact that we need electricity after dark, and batteries can't do it for us. Batteries alone can't do it for us. But Kathy, if I go back a little ways, she had a question about, does the combination of centralized and distributed generation contribute to reliability?
Could you repeat that?
Doesn't a combination of centralized and distributed generation contribute to reliability?
Yes. And so when you define reliability, it's basically availability of electricity when you want to use it, how you want to use it, in whatever quantity. And what a combination of distributed and long-term does is, for a given region in which there's some distributed, you'll need to make less. There'll be electricity available there, but electricity still needs to be balanced. The real question is, when one region in California is facing a shortfall, is there enough electricity there for that region to use? So when we think about creating that balance and policies for getting more distributed generation out there, part of the thought that needs to be given is, where is this distributed generation most required? And that's something that's not happened to date. So most of our policies, like net metering, there's just one incentive structure for all of Southern California Edison, say. But that doesn't solve the problem of, you may need a lot of solar and storage to best benefit the grid, deflect investments in a particular neighborhood, and maybe none in another neighborhood, right? So because so I grew up in this world mostly studying distributed energy resources. And one of the things that I've come to realize that's really hard practically is you depend on customer adoption and how a customer uses it. And if you really need electricity in one corner of Los Angeles, it's hard to depend on customers to adopt the right amount of solar and storage there and then to use it in the right way. Because if they don't do it perfectly, you'll still have to build something. So something we need to get better at is how to better locationally put these distributed resources and then how to get the best use out of them. And customer adoption is definitely a part of it, but what are other innovative ways of doing it? And that's one advantage of community solutions is if you can have a community solution where there is a need for electricity at a certain time, a local operator, utility, or a nonprofit can get to control it as opposed to private use. Because people, even the best, most willing people can't be expected to be electricity managers and lead normal lives, right? At some point in time, you need a dedicated electric operator.
Right. And electricity is one of those weird things where it isn't just having the right amount and getting it tomorrow. You need it now, because if the load, if people are using more electricity than you're, it's like a pipe. If people are using more electricity than you're putting in, then the 60 hertz, all of our appliances run at, expect the electricity alternating current to be at a certain frequency. And if you're withdrawing too much power and not backfilling it with enough power, then that pitch, that frequency slows down, and it can slow down so much that it fries everything that's plugged into the grid. So you really, it's enormously technologically challenging to make sure that you keep the frequency of alternating current at a very, very narrow band. You put in too much, if everybody decides to release the electricity from their solar panels into the grid instead of using it, they could also make the pitch, they could also make the frequency too high and also fry the electronics. So someone who manages the grid, that's why we have California in CAISO, independent service operators, they're managing the grid and monitoring it and balancing it all the time. That it is enormously complex and expensive.
The other thing to remember when we talk about solutions, distributed, centralized transmission distribution, is that for better or for worse, we've inherited a grid and now we need to get the best out of it. So the solutions that seem intuitive, if you were to start from scratch, say a new village in a different part of the world that doesn't have electricity, are very different from the solutions you implement in a place where you already have a grid that functions a certain way. Think of it as the constraints you have when you're remodeling a house versus building a new house. They're very different. And that can be counterintuitive when thinking about what sorts of solutions are best now. It is, for better or for worse, we've inherited this grid, and how do we get the most out of it going forward?
Right. And why would you have only one way to access the grid in a mountain town instead of multiple paths? And a lot of it has to do with where the roads are and where you might be able to get an easement to put in your lines, which property owners will give you an easement and stuff like that. And it may not be optimal in terms of the windstorms in that region, but that's the pathway that you've got. Have we answered it? Is there anyone that I haven't been monitoring it closely? Is there anyone who has an unanswered burning question? Well, oh my gosh, we've gone through an hour and a half. That went by really, really fast. Well,